In this video, we're going over some of the worst cards which technically allow you to gain life points. And at number 10, we have Muscle Medic. This is a 2200 attack level 4 monster, which is important because that's way higher than normal, where it has the ability that, if a player would take battle damage from this card, they instead gain that much life points. So if this attacks over one of your opponent's monsters, then they're just going to be continuously gaining life points, which isn't good for you, as you kind of want to make your opponent's life points go down and not up. Now, there are some decks which specialize in increasing your opponent's life points, more specifically Nurse Burn decks. And Nurse Burn decks have two cards which make it so any life points your opponent gains instead inflicts an equal amount of damage to them, which turns cards like Gift Card, a card which seems like it would be useless on surface level because it just gives your opponent 3,000 life points, actually a good burn card because 3,000 life points is a huge amount of burn in one go. However, Bad Reaction to Samachi and Muscle Medic literally just allows the card to function like normal, and isn't a real benefit. There are other cards with 2200 attack that are level 4 with negative effects, like Goblin Elite Attack Force, so there is a precedent set for this. Its effect is not unusual, as the whole point of these high attack low level monsters is to find some way to circumvent their negative side effects. With Goblin Elite Attack Force, what you can do is just play cards like Skill Drain in order to just negate its effects on the field, or Final Attack Orders so that it's always changed back to attack position. With Muscle Medic, it also benefits under Skill Drain since it negates its negative effect, and you can also use Bad Reaction to Samachi in order to allow it to deal damage like normal. Alternatively, you could just give this card to your opponent and just attack into it with a 0 attack monster in order to gain 2200 life points every time you did that. I'm not sure if there's a deck that could actually do this to advantage, but for the most part, Muscle Medic kind of came out way after high attack, low level monsters were meta relevant, as it came out in 2017. So it never saw any competitive play, and is not really worth running in any kind of actual deck. Although its usefulness is pretty obvious, so it's still better than everything else on this list, kind of. And at number 9, we have Gryphon's Feather Duster. This card simply has the effect where you can destroy all of your spell and trap cards in order to increase your life points by the amount of cards destroyed times 500. So if you destroy your entire back row, including your field spell card, you gain 2500 life points, which is a lot from one card, but not a lot for going -6 in card advantage. And if that were the end of Gryphon's Feather Duster, it would definitely be the worst life point gain card in the game. However, floating effects exist, and Gryphon's Feather Duster activates his life point increase effect at the same time as its destruction, which means it doesn't cause cards like Gear Town to miss timing. Gear Town is a field spell card, which has the effect where you can special summon an ancient gear monster from your hand, deck, or graveyard once it's destroyed on the field. Although Gear Town's effect is a when effect, which means it misses timing super easily. If you use a card like Storm, which also has the effect to destroy all of your spell and trap cards in order to gain a beneficial effect, Storm does cause Gear Town to miss its timing because after it destroys your spell and traps, it then counts the number of cards you destroyed in order to destroy the same amount of your opponent's spell traps. And since those effects do not happen simultaneously, Gear Town misses the timing to activate its effect. Not with Gryphon's Feather Duster though, because the life point gain happens as soon as the cards are destroyed without any delay. And purely because it doesn't cause cards to miss timing when its effect is used to destroy them, it does actually have some use, even if the life point gain is pretty minor. It's just there's also better cards which can also do the same thing, like Double Cyclone, or just archetype specific cards meant to destroy Gear Town, like Ancient Gear Catapult. And generally, archetypes which have spell and trap cards that float will have archetype specific cards in order to destroy them, so that you don't need cards like Gryphon Feather Duster. So it hasn't really seen competitive play, but it does have a niche use, even if there are technically better cards that can kind of do the same thing. And at number 8, we have Janice Lightsworn Mender. This card has the effect where during the end phase, if a card is sent from your deck to the graveyard by a Lightsworn effect, you can inflict 500 damage to your opponent and then gain 500 life points. Now, the Lightsworn archetype has this little gimmick where during the end phase they send a number of cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard as part of their effects during the end phase. And this is beneficial because the Lightsworn decks like to have their cards in the graveyard in order to activate a lot of their effects. And it's also just really good in other decks that like to put monsters in the graveyard. So Lightsworn engines have been played inside other decks basically since they came out. And Lightsworns are one of the few archetypes which constantly has seen competitive play over the years. However, Janice is one of the very few main deck Lightsworn monsters from the first wave of Lightsworns, which neither sends cards from the deck to the graveyard, or provides you advantage when sending cards from the deck to the graveyard. There is Wolf Lightsworn Beast, which also doesn't have an ability to mill cards, but has seen competitive play pretty much since it came out, because it directly benefits from being milled from the deck to the graveyard. Janice simply deals a little bit of damage and gains you a little bit of life points, if it's on the field while your other Lightsworn monsters are sending cards to the graveyard. It also has an incredibly low attack point value at only 300, and it doesn't special summon itself like Wolf, so you have to spend resources to get this card on the field. Then you have to find a way to get in defense position so it's not immediately destroyed by your opponent just breathing on it. And since it doesn't directly contribute to a Lightsworn's win condition, i.e. getting a bunch of cards in the graveyard, and in fact requires you to go out of your way to bring it on the field, it's easily one of the worst Lightsworn monsters. But I'm sure most people forget it's even part of the archetype. Even though it's one of the original Lightsworns, the fact that it also gives you a minor life point increase is why it's on this list. And at number 7, we have 7. This has got to be the shortest name of any card in the game, as it's literally just the number 7. And the fact that this card is the number 7 spot on this list is purely coincidental. It just kind of fits at this spot. Because you see, this card is definitely worse than the first 3 cards we've talked about, but it's also kind of better than the next 6. As what this card does is, if you have 3 copies of this card face up on your side of the field, because it's a continuous spell card, you can then draw 3 cards and then destroy all 3 copies of this card on the field. And the card has an additional effect where, if this card is sent directly from the field to the graveyard, you get to increase your life points by 700. So the effect sounds pretty good on paper. If you get 3 of these cards in the field, you get to draw 3 cards. So it's a pure 1-for-1 in card advantage, which would also net you 2100 extra life points in the process. However, getting 3 specific continuous spell cards on the field is difficult, because spell cards are some of the hardest cards to search out in the game, and expending resources in order to get this card on the field easier kinda defeats the whole purpose of the card. And there is no accumulative advantage you gain. You either get all 3 on the field and gain their benefits, or nothing. If you have 2 of the cards in the field and you're just waiting for the 3rd one, then you're basically just at a -2 in card advantage with those 2 cards, not really advancing the game state. However, if they're destroyed, you get some life points, which is a nice consolation prize. But it's not really the good effect, because unless your opponent destroys the card for you, then you have to spend resources trying to destroy the card if all you want are those life points, using something like Gryphon's Feather Duster, for example. But if you're just very lucky, and you know you can open up all 3 copies of these in your starting hand every time, then it's a pretty good cycling card through your deck, while also giving you extra life points. Which is why it has a slot machine in its card art, because that's not very likely. And at number 6, we have No Tori. This is a spirit monster which has the effect that when it inflicts battle damage to your opponent's life points, you gain an equal amount of life points as the damage inflicted. Now, this effect on the surface is fine. However, it's attached to a low-statted spirit monster, which makes it kinda bad. You see, spirit monsters are this type of card where they all share the distinction that they can't be special summoned, and they return to your hand during the end phase of the turn that they're normal summoned or flip face up. And both of those restrictions are really bad. Like, the card needs to be amazing to be worth being played. And there have been a number of really strong spirit monsters in the game's history, like Yatagarasu or Tsukiyomi. Although No Tori has an effect that's alright, which is just straight up bad on a spirit monster, where their effects need to be above average to be worth being played. You could attach this effect to just a regular level 4 monster with 1200 attack and it wouldn't see any competitive play. It being attached to a spirit monster is much worse. And at number 5, we have Muyen Curry. This card simply has the effect where you can choose one player in order to increase that player's life points by 200 points. So, if you have bad reaction to Samachi on the field, then you can use this card to inflict 200 points of damage to your opponent, or just give yourself 200 life points. It's also one of the few cards in the game which specifically designates that you target a player, which means you can use cards like Mystical Rough Panel in order to reflect it to a different player. Although there are a lot of cards which technically target a single player, which can also be reflected with Mystical Rough Panel, it's just Muyen Curry is one of the few which makes it so easy to see if Mystical Rough Panel actually works on the card or not. Now, the only problem with Muyen Curry is the fact that its effect is incredibly underpowered. It's basically the least amount of life points you can gain from a singular card, whose effect is purely to gain more life points and do nothing else. So, it's a -1 in card advantage for 200 extra life points, which is generally not worth a trade-off, and why it makes it on this list. And at number 4, we have Graceful Tear. This is a trap card which has the effect where you can add one card from your hand to your opponent's hand in order to gain 2000 life points. So it's a -3 in card advantage for 2,000 life points, as you lose the card Graceful Tear itself when it goes to the graveyard, you lose 1 card from your hand, and your opponent gains 1 card in their hand. And since the card doesn't affect the game state other than increasing your life points, it's just a lot of negative card advantage for a life point boost. There is actually another card in the game called Side Effects, which is a potential -4 in card advantage, although at least that card allows you to gain 6,000 life points for doing that effect. So Graceful Tear definitely seems like it's one of the worst life point gain cards in the game, and on surface level, it definitely is pretty bad. However, there are some cards in the game where it doesn't matter who activates them, as it affects both players equally. Think of cards like Cup of Ace. This card has the effect where if you flip a coin, then if the result is heads, you get to draw 2 cards. If the result is tails, then your opponent gets to draw 2 cards. The player who activates the card doesn't get to choose which result they want to pick, so technically it doesn't matter which player activates the effect, as you always have a 50% chance to draw 2 cards. So if you give your opponent a card like Cup of Ace, and then they just use the card, then regardless of the result, it's like you didn't lose any card advantage at all. It can also be used in order to thin out your opponent's deck by tricking them into using cards which mill a lot, with cards like Pot of Desires. This is a card which allows you to banish 10 cards from your deck in order to draw 2 cards. If you're playing a mill deck, a deck which is trying to make your opponent run out of cards in their deck, giving your opponent a copy of Pot of Desires in order to activate the effect of Graceful Tear is equivalent to milling 1/4 of their deck if they actually use it, which is a huge amount to mill for a 2-card combo. What I'm trying to say is there are some uses to giving your opponent a card in their hand, and the amount of life points you gain is enough where it's not insignificant, but it's definitely not enough where the card is trying to offset its downside too heavily. The card is in this weird place, where it seems like the card was made bad on purpose, but it actually is a little bit more useful than what a normally useless card would look like. So it's still on this list, there are ways to use it to advantage, but none of them are super competitive or even super practical, but it's not completely useless either. And at number 3, we have the Immortal of Thunder. This is a flip effect monster which has the effect that you gain 3,000 life points when it's flipped face up. However, it has a negative effect where if this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, you lose 5,000 life points. And this negative effect is worded in a way where it's very hard to circumvent that effect. If you increase your life points by 3,000 with its full effect, and then give control of the card to your opponent with something like Creature Swap, you'll still take 5,000 points of damage after it's sent to the graveyard. And the 5,000 life reduction is done in a way where it's not technically dealing damage to you, so you can't reflect it to your opponent with something like Barrel Behind the Door. In fact, one of the only ways to actually avoid the downsides of this card while gaining its upside is to flip it face up and then use it as an Xyz material for an Xyz monster. Because Xyz materials are sent to the graveyard are not counted as being sent from the field to the graveyard, so it's not impossible to circumvent its downside, but it's so impractical to try to flip this card up and then use it for an Xyz summon that the card itself is just kinda bad. The net amount of life points you lose from this card is 2,000, although it's possible to lose 5,000 life points without ever gaining the 3,000 life points if the card is simply destroyed while it's still face down before it has a chance to be flipped face up, which is how most flip effect monsters are destroyed in the modern metagame, and that's kind of the reason why flip cards don't really see competitive play outside of sub-terrors. And at number 2, we have Hysteric Fairy. This monster has the effect where you contribute 2 monsters on your side of the field to increase your life points by 1,000. This card was released in the early days of the game, and having 1800 attack baseline, it was actually played as just a high-statted level 4 fairy monster. And generally, high-statted level 4 monsters had negative effects attached to them, whereas Hysteric Fairy's negative effect was just having a bad effect that didn't actually impact the card unless you choose to use it. So if you just completely ignore the effect of the card, it was basically a vanilla beater. Although, going based on the actual effect of the card, attributing 2 monsters to increase your life points by only 1,000 is not very good either. There is the fact that this card does not have a once per turn on this effect, so if you have a way to get out a whole bunch of cards in order to activate this card effect, you're better off just using Cannon Soldier in order to actually win the game instead of just increasing your life points for no reason. And the reason offering 2 monsters as a tribute for only 1,000 life points isn't very good is because you have to spend resources to get monsters on the field in the first place, and monsters themselves are a valuable resource. So tributing a card for an effect is one of the harshest costs a card can have, so it better be worth the effect of actually doing it. Kind of like how spirit monsters have to have good effects in order to be worth playing because they're so detrimental. And there are some really good cards which have tribute costs, like Monster Gate or Lone Fire Blossom. Since the act of getting life points itself is incredibly minor, as far beneficial effects go, Attributing 2 monsters for such a minor effect is just way disproportionate to the cost for its benefit, which is why it's so high on this list. And at number 1, we have Princess Pikeru. This is a 2000 attack level 4 monster, which is pretty high for a level 4 monster, although that does come at the detriment where this card cannot be normal summoned or set, and it can only be special summoned with the effect of Trial of the Princess. And the card on the field has the effect where during each of your standby phases you gain 800 life points for each monster you control. Trial of the Princess is an equipped spell card which can only be equipped to 2 specific monsters, where it has the effect to grant them 800 attack, and as a condition where, if the monster is equipped to destroys a level 5 or higher monster by battle, you can then tribute the equipped monster in order to special summon from your deck Princess Pikeru or Princess Kura, depending on which of the 2 cards you had this card equipped to. And that condition is actually pretty tough to pull off, since it requires your opponent to have a level 5 or higher monster in the first place. Then you have to destroy that level 5 or higher monster with a monster that probably only has 2000 attack. And bringing out Princess Pikeru is definitely not worth the effort of even trying, as it just gives you life points in your standby phase based on the number of monsters you control, but not enough where it's worth going through all that effort. In fact, there are very few life point gain cards in the game that are worth going through all the effort to gain their effects, as the whole act of gaining life points isn't actually very beneficial. Although explaining why is a very long topic, which I do cover in a different video, suffice to say, gaining life points doesn't really advance the game state, and you only need 1 life point in order to win. So if bringing out a card whose whole benefit is just gaining you life points, and it's incredibly convoluted to bring that card out, then it's probably not very good. Alright, and that's the list. If you have any ideas for future videos just like this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments.